A lot of people are very concerned with regard to South Africa, and that's really the purpose of the meeting, and we'll see how that turns out.
Welcome one and all to the Lead's big, beautiful Trump tariff explainer. My News 24 business colleague William Brederode and I hope that all of your burning questions about the US's 1 August 30% slap on South African exports will be answered by the end of this show.
Two things you got to keep in mind is there are certain sectors where he's applied a sectoral tariff. Two examples, you got the auto industry, which I believe it's 25%.
Correct,
on
yeah.
all auto exports to the US. Aluminium at this point I think is up to 50. There's also a percentage for steel. Those will be independent from the country tariff. The 10% that has been in place since the 2 April Liberation Day announcement, come 1 August, will go up to 30%.
Like, which of our local economic sectors could be hit the hardest?
Ostrich feathers is one that he found that we send to the US. And I can't imagine they'd want to send ostrich feathers to the US if it was more expensive.
Later in the show, Bheki Cele admits he twice slept over the Cats Pretoria penthouse. And finally, Vian Mulder makes Protea history.
To know when the next episode drops, hit the like, follow, and subscribe buttons on our YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcast channels.
Here's some of your comments at the end of the show. If you'd like to engage us on this episode's topics, you can send us your thoughts and opinions to the official Lead WhatsApp line. That number's 072 562 3179. My name's Graham Robenheimer. Let's chat all this and more right here on The Lead on News 24. In less than a month, South African produce being shipped to the United States will face remarkably higher tariffs. This week, US President Donald Trump signed a letter off to Pretoria warning that 30% tariffs on certain South African exports will come into effect on the 1st of August. But President Cyril Ramaphosa, who's been rubbing shoulders with his BRICS counterparts, claims Trump's reasoning and methodology for South Africa just doesn't square up. Can Ramaphosa's trade team change Trump's mind in time? It doesn't look great. Well, joining me in the Cape Town studio now to help us explain our US export quagmire is the very excellent William Brederode with the News 24 business team. William, finally, I got you into the hot seat on The Lead. How are you doing?
About time. Excellent. How are you doing, Graham?
Yeah, I can't complain. You really have been the star of the News 24 business team over the last, I would say, 24 hours, trying to get Trump's news in. I thought this was quite interesting. When we saw each other this morning getting our coffees, you basically, one of the first things said to me is that, did you see that Trump's letter to South Africa was basically like a letter template?
So that's what shocked me is, what disdain for your trading partners to not even have the courtesy to rewrite or write a personalized letter to each country explaining the situation. It was literally just a copy and paste with a new name and a different percentage. And also, a letter is a bit of a grandiose way to describe what it was. It was just a social media post addressed to a world leader.
On his own social media company.
On his own platform. He's not using X as much anymore because he's not great buddies with Musk. I don't know if you've heard.
So how many countries did he issue these letters to? It wasn't just South Africa. I saw Japan also made the list this time around.
So it was 14 countries which got the letter last evening. I think more in the offing because the expiry date for the 90-day pause he placed on his Liberation Day tariff announcement ends on the 9th. So the 10th would have been the first day that tariffs would have come into effect, but he's extended that to the 1st of August. So it was 14 other countries, Japan and South Korea were the first.
Many Asian countries, right?
Lots of Asian countries. I think in Africa, Tunisia was there. I didn't see any other African countries. But yeah, 14. I'm not sure why those 14 countries were the first.
Right.
But, there you
go.
Be it.
Yes, so be it.
Those are the ones who got it. Yeah.
That was Trump's decision, right? Interesting that he used the sort of same letter template. I thought that was quite funny. But anyway, before we delve deep into the different South African export categories, right? Because this has often been the sort of missing blind spot for many people wanting to get involved in this conversation. What does Trump's 30% slap for South Africa mean at this point? Does it gobble up the previous 10% that he had sort of touted? It obviously does away with AGOA, but does it run concurrently with any other tariffs, or is it just, boom, 30% now?
So it's two things you got to keep in mind. Is there are certain sectors where he's applied a sectoral tariff. Two examples, you got the auto industry, which I believe it's 25%.
Correct,
on
yeah.
all auto exports to the US. Aluminium at this point, I think, is up to 50. There's also a percentage for steel. Those will be independent from the country tariff, on my understanding. The 10% that has been in place since the 2 April Liberation Day announcement, come 1 August, will go up to 30%. The other thing is there's certain products, notably for us, precious metals, gold, platinum, that are exempt from tariffs. So it's actually our largest export to
It's more than half, right?
It's not more than half. It's around a third.
Around a
that
third.
are
Okay.
precious metals. And they're exempt from tariffs at this stage. So those are sort of the three categories. You've got some products which are exempt, some which are sectoral, so it's applied to just that category of exports, and then the rest will fall into that 30% come 1 August.
But I mean, what's been sort of interesting is somebody just sort of spectating it on the side. AGOA is kind of like it's a foregone conclusion. It's gone now.
It's a go is a goner. There was a headline saying that at some point, which I thought was very good. As I understand it, we should forget about it. It's gone.
Unless, Ramaphosa and our trade and industry minister, Park Stav, pulls the rabbit out of the hat suddenly before the 1st of August, which I highly doubt, right?
Well, I highly doubt it, because my understanding is that there were around 90 countries which came to the US after the 2 April announcement looking to strike a deal.
Or renegotiate, basically.
Renegotiate. Say, well, how can we find each other here? To my knowledge, there's only 2 who've struck a deal. I think China's a partial deal. The UK and Vietnam. So those odds don't look good to me that we'll be able to strike a deal if in the 3 months that we've had a pause, 2 out of 90 have found a deal. He seems hell-bent on eliminating the trade deficit that the US has with other countries. So he ran on the fact that he was going to introduce tariffs. I don't suddenly see him striking a whole lot of deals to get rid of these tariffs. Who knows?
Meanwhile, in Rio de Janeiro, the BRICS Heads of State Summit has been sort of held, and President Cyril Ramaphosa has been the only one thus far that's sort of been quite outspoken about Trump's threat of a further 10% slap of tariffs on countries aligned with the BRICS group of nations. I thought that was also kind of interesting. The timing has sort of played itself this week.
Yeah. Again, who knows what's going to happen with that? Ramaphosa, I believe, said that there was nothing in the statements made by the BRICS nations at the gathering which was anti-American. I believe that was Trump's complaint, is that we need an additional 10% because they're anti-American, no exceptions. Ramaphosa was saying, well, there simply wasn't anything that was said which was anti-American. But I mean, that at this stage is just a black box. I don't think we know what's going to happen with that 10%. Will it be in addition to the extra country tariffs? It's too early to say. One wonders whether Trump has thought what it means.
Yes. Firstly, how's the rand done? We don't have to look too closely at that either. It looks like it was hit a little bit after this announcement, but has seemingly bounced back a little bit.
My reading, just reading a couple of headlines, doesn't seem like it's moved a lot in response to the announcement. I asked the oracle of our office, Carol Payton, and she said the rand is largely moving based on dollar weakness. So there's such a tumultuous international climate that it seems like any movements of the rand we'd have to attribute to that.
But some analysts were saying that this is essentially what, and especially US analysts are calling for the global trade market, is that this is now called Taco Tuesdays, basically. Trump always chickens out. So he makes these big sort of like, hey, we're going to place these huge tariffs on you. It's supposed to have some sort of effect on the market. And here we really see the rand not really being all that much volatile in comparison. I thought that was quite interesting.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the uncertainty that something like this creates has its own negative effects. I have spoken a little bit with an industry body representing the boat manufacturing industry, which has become a booming business in Cape Town. And one of their largest, it's yachts that we make now. And I think it's growing 25% year on year. We sent 1.5 billion rand worth of yachts, not necessarily just yachts, but boats.
It's really cool.
To the US. You'll have an order book in that industry stretching 2 years back, 2 years forward rather. So you thought you could depend on orders for your yachts 2 years into the future. But now, if it's going to become 30% more expensive for people in the US to buy your yachts, and our big competitor there is France, and who knows what tariff the EU will get. How do you plan as a player in that industry now that, well, there's a 30% tariff which has been announced, but last time there was a 31% tariff which was announced, which got pushed back, and then there was a 90-day pause.
And there's these different sectors with different tariff amounts, percentages.
So maybe Trump always chickens out, but the uncertainty he's creating is having its own negative effects.
Okay, you've brilliantly put it there. South African trade to the US, you've mentioned some of it already. What's our biggest exports to the US specifically and historically within the most recent years? Which are going to be exempt? You've also given us a little bit of an allusion there. And then which will be not? And I understand that the agriculture sector is the big not one, right? We're a big exporter of, I didn't know this, macadamia nuts.
I wrote this fascinating and, interesting if we want to talk about it. South Africa is the world's largest producer of macadamia nuts.
Amazing.
And that is quite a recent development. In the last 2 decades, we've planted a whole bunch. Interestingly, and this actually does tie in, macadamia nuts, macadamia trees, are 60% of the macadamia trees in the country are not yet at full bearing. So not only do we have a massive macadamia nut industry, but it's going to continue to grow because we've planted a whole bunch of trees which aren't producing nuts yet. Once they produce nuts, they could go for 200 years. If your largest market was the US and you're a macadamia nut farmer and you've got a whole bunch of trees in the ground which will produce nuts for 200 years, how do you pivot from something like this? Anyway, that's macadamia.
Yeah, but it's so well. Thank you for bringing us up to speed with that.
This is sort of the way I think we should look at this conversation. Is if you and I'll get to your question now. So we sent in 2024 157 billion rand worth of goods to the US. That's around, and this is rough. It's my own little handkerchief calculation, but around 2%.
It's the William Brederode certified calculation sheet.
Exactly. So discount it. Around 2% of our GDP is that 157 billion we sent to the US. Now, around a third of that is precious metals. So that's 55 billion. And this is 2024 numbers. So last year, most recent year. That, as I understand it, the categories in there are exempt. So that 55 billion, around a third of our exports to the US, safe. The next biggest category is vehicles. And that includes, I believe the category includes cars and car accessories and boats. Vehicles have their own sectoral tariff. So that's been 25% since, I believe it was April that was announced. Ships is an issue, but it's a relatively small portion there. So vehicles is 34 billion. So now plus the precious metals, vehicles plus precious metals, around half of our exports to the US. And yeah, precious metals safe, vehicles not so safe.
I think that's the discrepancy I didn't realize earlier, is that the slightly more than half is vehicles with the precious metals. I think that's what I was missing out on earlier.
Yeah. So
now, what of that is exempt and what's not? Those are all exempt.
The precious metals, as I understand it, are all exempt.
But obviously not the vehicle sector.
Not the vehicles.
Right.
The next biggest is ores. So it includes aluminium, iron, steel. That's around 20% of our exports to the US. There's trouble. There are sectoral tariffs on aluminium and I believe steel as well. And I'm not sure of the exemptions, but I think that category, there's risks.
Yes. And of course, with, the looming news, the bad news of a possible steel mill plant closures in South Africa hasn't been great to add to that mix. Although there has been some efforts to save up in Newcastle and those sort of areas.
Exactly. The next biggest category is agriculture. So that's about 10 billion of the 155. As you alluded to, nuts is quite a big one. Citrus is huge. And that industry, there's no protection. So the key there will be to find alternative markets for those goods. Just because we're sending 10 billion and now there's the tariff doesn't mean that'll drop to zero, but we'll have to wait and see how that 30% shock affects that industry. But certainly not good. So we need to put this in perspective. The 155 billion that we send to the US, around 2%, is in the wider scheme of things not going to derail the economy, but it's certainly not it's not a good thing that this has now been made vulnerable,
especially with our slow growth.
However, while it might not be, the absolute worst thing on a macro level, it's definitely not good, but there are these sectors that are potentially at risk. Citrus, boat building, nuts, our auto sector, which employ huge amounts of people. And you can see it's not unlikely that there'll be a big hit in some of those sectors from these tariffs.
You're listening to the latest edition of The Lead on News 24 with Graham Rowenheimer. If you've got an opinion on what you've heard so far, drop us a short voice note on our WhatsApp hotline. That's 072-562-3179.
Excellently put. Now comes down to the nuts and bolts. Hey, did you see what I did there? And President Cyril Ramaphosa and his Trade and Industry Minister, Parkstyle, they've been trying to find some sort of deal. And there's been quite a bit of rejection from the White House side of things. I thought quite interestingly is that one of the earlier deals that the president put forward was, we'll take some of US fruit out of season, out of South African season, on a counter sort of cyclical way. And that could be something that was suggested. That was also shot down. Now it looks as if the US Trump administration sort of come with this blanket template deal for the entire continent. So it's not necessarily something that's in tune with what South Africa's got offered on the table. But apparently the president hasn't even seen this apparent template. Is that right?
That's how I understand it.
Yeah.
Is we came to them with a deal which we put on the table shortly before the Oval Office meeting. There was then word that there's templates for Africa that we need to try and align our offer with. And that's why DTIC Minister Parkstyle said, please, could we have an extension because we're not sure what you want. So give us a little bit of time to work out what you want and align ourselves with that, or see if we can align ourselves with that. And as of last evening, that we clearly have not gotten that extension. But that's my understanding, is that there's a template and we have no idea what the template is.
Sure.
So how we align ourselves with it would seem to be a challenge.
So in other words, as it stands, as this... Oh, I didn't press record. Joking. As it stands, this recording of this particular podcast, we are headed 1 August, South Africa. Whether we like it or not, to a 30% sort of Trump tariff announcement that's going to come into effect.
That's the latest. Whether there's a deal that can be struck, I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. My sense is the fact that there have been so few deals struck so far is a bad omen for the likelihood of us striking a deal before then. But who knows? He's announced a 30% tariff on us before, and it then there was the 90-day pause. So I don't know, and I don't think anybody does. But the latest word out of the White House is that there will be a 30% tariff imposed on South Africa come 1 August. Whether that remains in place come 1 August, we'll have to see.
Lastly, just to end off, who do you think are the biggest losers in terms of the South African economy? Is it the agriculture sector?
I think so. It's sort of independent of yesterday's news, but the auto sector is also, I suspect, going to be hit hard by this. It was already not a great operating environment for them. And then, it's those smaller industries you might not think of, something like ships. We send a lot of wine to the US. I mean, that falls under agriculture, but
Tasty wine,
tasty wine, and up until now, well-priced wine. But it's also difficult to. What we really need is a full picture of the tariff that other countries are getting, because it'll take a while for, if it ever happens, for the US to build its own manufacturing capacity in the things, for the categories of things that we send to them. But it's hard to assess the impact that the tariff will have on a given sector, given the fact that we don't know yet how our rival countries are also exporting to the US, what tariff they're going to have.
And what tariffs South Africa is putting on US imports here, because that's also been...
That's something we should discuss.
Let's end off with that, I think.
Okay.
Because that's 8%, apparently.
So that's what Ramaphosa says, is that we put an average of 8%. It's not a flat
on US
rate
imports.
On US imports into South Africa. Trump's letter, which was the generic template, but we also got one, kind of removes our ability to wiggle on that. Well, we could wiggle down. We can't really wiggle up, because he threatens in that letter that if a country is to up their tariff, the US will up the tariff
by how much that percentage
is on the country. So if we were to decide, okay, we're upping our tariffs on US imports by 5%, Trump said he'd turn around and say, okay, you didn't like your 30%, try 35%. So there's not a lot of
That's how much
room.
I got for maths, by the way.
Okay.
In grade 9, 35%, but carry on.
There's not a lot of wiggle room to increase our tariffs and respond in that way. So we'll be watching the DTIC closely in the weeks that come to see how they do respond to this, and if there's any response that the US would accept.
What does the US immediately lose from South Africa? What is that one thing that they, Americans over there are going to feel like, hey, I missed that South African thing? Do you know?
I don't, but my colleague was actually looking, I'm not sure where he found the source, so this could be wrong. Alert, could be wrong. Ostrich feathers is one that he found that we send to the US. And I can't imagine they'd want to send ostrich feathers to the US if it was more expensive. So the long and the short of it is we don't really know, because if we were sending 100 Rand worth of citrus to the US, and now it's going to become 30% more expensive for them to buy our citrus, we don't know how much less citrus the US will buy from us and how much they'll now decide to buy from Spain or whichever other country. So we don't know. We don't know exactly what substitutions and, what American consumers will say. Well, actually, we were prepared to, we loved nachos, but we're not prepared to pay this amount for nachos, so we don't want them anymore. We don't really know what goods will be price sensitive in that nature, such that the additional tariffs mean that the consumers there don't want them anymore.
Right.
And we don't exactly know what the importers they will be able to absorb and versus passing on to the consumer. So I suppose that's still a black box. And that's one of the things we've been banging on the door of every producers organization we can find which represents a good that gets exported to the US. And some of them, quite rightly, don't want to comment on the potential impact yet because they don't know. And if they don't know, probably find nobody does. So
not these two buffoons with
we
two
can
mics in the Cape Town studios. And hell of a no. We're just a bunch of mixed nuts, macadamia nuts. And then, my thought process also led to, and then what do we lose out from other countries that may potentially, obviously, impose their own tariffs that might also affect us? And, that sort of lends us to a very interesting sort of situation where you get like the United Kingdom, for example, that had to renegotiate a hell of a lot of the trade deals in the wake of Brexit, for example. And then there's also another theory that because of what Trump's doing on this, global scale, it's from a very neoliberal perspective, but that everybody's now going to impose all these tariffs. And so that's going to potentially exacerbate sort of the next sort of Great Depression, inadvertent commas, right? What do we lose out from other countries potentially? That's a black box in itself, right?
I think it's a bit of a black box, but my instinct, which may be wrong, is that we're going to have to trade more with other countries to make up the deficit of what we're not sending to the US. And if we're going to have to do that, you better believe Thailand is thinking exactly the same thing. And
100%.
Japan is thinking exactly the same thing. And so is South Korea. So to my sense is that there's going to be more trade between other countries outside of the US. So the effect then on consumers here is maybe Thailand are more open to striking a deal with us, and we send them some of our nachos. And what do they make in Thailand? What's something they could send to us?
They might want our macadamia nuts.
They might want our macadamia nuts or our yachts.
Or our tourists.
So there's some goods which you can imagine it being fairly easy to find an alternative market outside of the US, like nuts. Something like cars is much more difficult. You're not necessarily going to find a big market for cars if you just strip the US back. But there's going to be I would assume that there's going to be a lot of calls made between a lot of world leaders to try and strike deals outside of the US.
William, when will you and I and everybody in the News 24 newsroom and everybody in South Africa feel Trump's slapping off 30% on our economy? When will we really affect it? Probably only a couple of months from now, right?
So I asked a couple of economists exactly that question around to April, because that's when we thought we'd be dealing with the tariff. The short answer, I believe, is not right away, because it's important to remember that essentially the tariff is forcing people who want to bring goods from South Africa into the US to pay 30% more for them. It's a tax on American importers, not on South African exporters. It doesn't work that neatly, though, because there might be an arrangement where the importer says, okay, well, we're going to have to pay 30% more, so we'll split it with you. And then, obviously, some of that gets passed on to consumers in the US. beyond the short answer of nothing instantly for South African consumers in our economic model, who knows?
The world's longest pregnant pause. No, I'm waiting with bated breath. I know you calculate your thoughts.
It's not a tax on goods that are in South Africa. So if anything, something like macadamia nuts, if we were sending a whole bunch to the US, and there's now an oversupply here and we can't find an alternative market, you'd kind of expect it to get cheaper in the short run in South Africa. The issue is less for consumers on that sort of timescale and more for producers. Is how does this tariff, for an automaker who is sending a large number of cars to the US, can they still employ 3,000 people at their plant, or do they need to downscale it? Will a macadamia farmer plant any more trees if the US is not going to be as good of a market for its products for the foreseeable future? Those are the sorts of impacts I expect. It's more on the producer side than the consumer side. However, it's a complicated, interconnected financial system, and who knows how it'll ripple around.
Oh no, but that guy that was born in Pretoria, you mentioned him earlier. What's his name again? Musk or something. He's going to start his own political party in the US.
Yeah.
And then he's gonna change everything, right?
Well, that sounds. Looking forward to it,
I call him Billy, but his real name is William Brederode. He's part of our amazing award-winning News 24 business team. I wouldn't say your latest piece I'd point readers to. I'd actually point readers to your 3rd of April News 24 piece entitled Key South African Exports Dodge Trump's 31% Tariff, but Farmers Will Hurt. I thought there you give a lot more detail about the extent of which sectors of the economy will be exempt and not. And I thought that was quite a great piece, although not updated with the latest.
That probably is the best to get a sense of what we have been sending to the US and how it might be affected by the tariff.
Fantastic. And of course, if you're a News 24 subscriber, you can go and read it, right?
Exactly. Yeah. What a lovely, lovely offering.
Fantastic. Shifting to our trending topic now, and it's an update from our previous show's top story. It's emerged that former Police Minister Bheki Cele once stayed at the ritzy Pretoria penthouse, a gift given by the controversial tender don Vusi Musi Kat Matlala. Specialist investigative journalist Jeff Wex has revealed that Cele snoozed at the capital Menlyn, Maine back in January. Furthermore, Matlala, who's facing attempted murder charges for the failed hit on the life of actress Tebogo Tobojane, in fact won the dodgy 360 million rand SAPS Health Services tender whilst Cele was still the minister. Outspoken KwaZulu-Natal Police Commissioner Nhlanhla Mkonazi has pitted the cat at the center of claims of political and criminal interference in the upper echelons of the South African Police Service. Cele has admitted to knowing Matlala and staying at his swanky pad not once but twice, but has also denied being friends or in business with him. Now, for a whole lot more, check out Jeff's compelling 9 live series trending on the front page of News 24. What say you? You can drop us a voice note on this topic, 072 562 3179.
Listen Up is News 24's sharp new podcast, where hosts Tim Cohen and Mark Barnes cut through the clutter with bold takes and unfiltered insight.
They're not fighting for the good of South Africa. And so this is degenerated into a series of tit-for-tat spats. How's that for a bit of poetry early in the morning?
Smart, punchy, and unapologetically real.
President Ramaphosa has explained why he did it, and the reason he did it was because he said that people weren't allowed to go to America, and then Andrew Whitfield did, and then there's a dispute about whether or not he asked.
Catch new episodes of Listen Up every Tuesday on News 24 or wherever you get your podcasts.
I know a lot about this. Not really.
Yeah,
but
there we go.
Here goes.
Here goes. The accused for a change. Yeah.
And finally, he's the talk of the town, the current cream of the local cricketing crop. Wiaan Mulder's triumphant and record-breaking 367 runs. Just repeat that, 367 runs against Zimbabwe and Bulawayo have come in for major applause, and some Protea fans questioning. Mulder declared at lunch on day 2 within striking distance of eclipsing the great Brian Lara's 400-run heroics. Mulder's reasoning has been that Lara is a legend and should thus keep his record against the English back in 2004, which had some fans claiming Mulder should have just broken it as any sportsman usually does. Still, it's now the best Test cricket score Protea batsman's ever clocked, overtaking Hashim Amla, and that's a beautiful record in itself. As News 24 sport editor Lloyd Bernard writes, Coach Shukri Conrad's gamble on promoting Mulder, a promising all-rounder, to number 3 has now paid off. Now that the Protea fire's red hot, let's see how Mulder strikes against more formidable foes in future. From breaking Test cricket records to traversing Trump's tariffs, it's Tuesday, and I hope the leads kept you up to speed with everything you ought to know this week thus far. Received a lot of comments in response to our previous edition entitled, "Is the SAPS captured with Jeff Wicks?" We spoke about how the gloves are now off. In a startling Sunday press conference, KwaZulu-Natal's Provincial Police Commissioner Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi had publicly claimed that the heart of the South African Police Service has now been captured. He's alleged that Minister Senzo Mchunu has ties to the underworld, and together with Deputy National Commissioner Shadrack Sibia and an associate known as Brown Mahotsi, that they've all played a part in politically interfering in the SAPS. Of course, as we spoke about earlier, the cat's name comes up as well. Just Saying Again writes, the only reason why South Africa is not completely degenerated into a completely lawless society is that the average citizen still has some semblance of what is right and wrong. The clowns at the helm is clueless and arrogant, but as the saying goes, the wheel is round, quote unquote, from that comment there. Another goes, yes, everywhere the ANC moves or tries to move and everything with it becomes captured. Induno asks, what is Bheki Cele up to and who does he back? And Darth Vader, no, not that Darth Vader, but another Darth Vader, writes, to me, this saga goes back to Babita Diekaran, Gauteng Department of Health, and Tembisa Hospital, and the billions looted there. But the kingpins and the money was never identified and recovered. All the information provided by the media, graphics and all, never blew this case open, pointed to some protection from within the police services. The hitman claimed ministers William Kize had paid them. I don't believe Kat Matlala was the kingpin. There's a bigger story at play there. The health services is a major extraction point and part of the bigger NHI play, but someone will have to join those particular dots. It's a very interesting sort of question put there by Darth Vader. And then lastly, on the actual topic of the show, is the SAPS captured? Erasmus writes, it is not a question of it, it's a question of to what extent. We'll be playing out all your voice notes before the end of the week, so stay tuned to that. If you'd like to send your voice notes in relation to today's topic, that number again, 072-562-3179. Hit the follow and subscribe buttons in the meantime on our Spotify, Apple, and YouTube podcast channels. It helps you to be reminded of when our next edition drops. Every show is different. You're going to be hearing about something new every single time. My name's Graham Robenheimer, and so long as there's news, we'll have the lead.